Good morning to you. Now, by this time next week, the Brighton Declaration may have immortalised this city as the place where the decision was made to curb the power of the European Court of Human Rights. Some British politicians complain it's given too many rights to prisoners and non-European criminals. Some Eastern European nations think it has pandered to the gay and lesbian community. But elderly couples thank it for giving them the right to stay together when social services decide one of them needs to be cared for in a home. And Lord Carey, the former Archbishop of Canterbury, wants it to safeguard the right of Christians to display their faith. Has Europe created too many rights? Well, Paul Houston, you, of course, your daughter Amy, you lead this campaign, the Justice for Amy campaign. 12 years old, run over by this man, an Iraqi asylum seeker. He then ran away from the scene. He was caught, sentenced to 8 months in prison, served only 2. He lost his application to stay here, but he wasn't deported. He's still here. Mm-hmm. Why do you blame, in this terrible case, why do you blame the European Court of Human Rights for the fact that he's still here and natural justice has not been served?
Human rights is about balance and fairness. It's about protecting the innocent and the vulnerable. It's very galling when Amy, my only child, was killed and I don't have a family life anymore, that Mr. Ibrahim should claim that his rights have been deprived and he's been deprived of a family life. At no point was my viewpoint took into consideration in the courts. And when I asked the human rights barrister for the UKBA what my rights were, he said, quite frankly, Mr. Houston, you haven't got any. And how can that be right in a fair and balanced society?
That's what he said.
That's what he said. So my problem with the Human Rights Act is I believe in human rights, but I believe it's about balance and fairness. And I believe that my rights should have been taken into consideration, and they haven't been.
And Paul, this was Article 8, wasn't it? The right to a family life, and you believe he had no family life before that and just sort of got one together and used it as an arguing point.
It's a definition of what is a family life. It's so, the scope is that wide, but it basically covers anything. And in some cases, the people aren't married, then sometimes they don't have any children, sometimes you don't even see the children. In some cases, it's just because they have a mother and father. So
you think it's ludicrous? You think it's a nonsense?
Yeah, so quite frankly, everybody has a family life. But, you know, the thing is, you know, it just can't be right, basically.
Kind of like Lucas, decisions like this are crazy, aren't they?
I mean, that is a very, very troubling situation. It's an awful situation that you've described. As I understand it, it's to do with the way in which that particular interpretation happened, and I think Libet has done some work on that. But I don't think it undermines the ultimate question that, although there are examples like the horrendous one that you've described, which I absolutely wouldn't support, that the Human Rights Act exists as a way of encoding the most important rights that we have, your right to a family life as well as the rights of others when they can demonstrate that. And what worries me is that all of the discussion about scrapping it makes it sound as if it's very contingent, it's just an issue of fashion, when you've got the Home Secretary talking about immigrants not being allowed to be deported because they've got a cat. I mean, this is a ridiculous sort of story. So what I hope we can get out of this debate is a really mature discussion about where one person's right impinges on another person's responsibility.
Well, you know, the media has a role to play in this to report these things correctly. You know, nobody wants to see a scrapping of Article 8. What we want to do is we want to see it reforming, you know, and it's the interpretation and getting an agreed opinion across Europe, because
the proper application
of it. Because it does actually say in Article 8 that it can be overruled for other people's human rights. And I think if the judge had all the facts in front of him, I think he would possibly come to a different conclusion.
Isabella?
Could I just come in? The first thing to say is that we have so much respect to Liberty for the way in which you've entered this debate. We can't possibly imagine the horror and the trauma that you've been through. But I think in your case, as in so many others, the Human Rights Act isn't actually to blame, although I think you have been badly failed by the system. The thing that we don't understand is why the Home Office only sought the deportation of the man who was responsible for your daughter's death 5 years after.
But we are where we are, and then the Human Rights Act came into play.
Let me just finish. It was in that period that he established his family ties here, had 2 children and adopted 2 more. And it was those children's rights that the judge was concerned about. But the Home Office could have deported him sooner, and the judge in the case said that they probably would have succeeded.
Okay. Yeah, but
the other thing that doesn't make sense is why he was only prosecuted with actually quite a minor offence, driving without insurance, when it seems to us that he could quite easily have been prosecuted with something more serious.
Dominic Robb, is this the fault of the British courts or the European Court of Human Rights? It's ultimately this decision.
It's a bit of both.
Yeah.
But the truth is, this Article 8 issue is not just a one-off in Paul's case. The Home Office has done the data on this. 400 cases a year of foreign criminals successfully challenging their deportation orders on the grounds of these opaque and ever-expanding rights to family life and other social ties. This is 61% of successful challenges to deportation orders by foreign criminals. And I think actually we need to look at the European dimension, we also need to look at the domestic dimension. No one disagrees with the fundamental core list of freedoms in the European Convention, but the way they've been expanded exponentially by judges is a serious problem.
They haven't been expanded, and before the Human Rights Act came into force in 2000, it was possible for a foreign criminal to claim...
We didn't have 61% of those cases.
Well, no one has the statistics on that. So
we do.
So
the Home Office has produced it.
But the last Conservative government actually incorporated Article 8 principles into domestic law before the Human Rights Act
So do you agree
into
then,
force.
by definition, that as a democracy we can set those standards, and if we think the balance has swung too far the other way, by definition, scale them back a bit?
Well, the whole point about the Convention, the Human Rights Act, Dominic, as you well know, is that Parliament has the final say. Parliament is sovereign,
no problem with us.
It can decide
So you've got no problem with us changing the
rules
balance?
as it wishes, and it does. But the problem is when politicians, and not just yourself but others, including the Prime Minister actually, talk about Human Rights Act judgments and European Court of Human Rights Act judgments as if they have no power over them or no say, when actually it's up to Parliament to decide how to respond to them.
I couldn't agree more with you. I think parliamentarians, MPs across the board need to stand up and be responsible for the laws we're passing. That includes the Human Rights Act. But actually, there is cross-party consensus for reform of the European Court of Human Rights. The Bill of Rights Commission has cross-party membership, supports the idea that Strasbourg should intervene a bit less in UK law.
The Bill of Rights Commission was a political fix after the last election because the
you
Conservatives
can rubbish
and the Liberal Democrats
Helena Kennedy and Lord Leicester if you like, but the Bill of Rights Commission...
I've said nothing about Lord Leicester and Helena Kennedy. He was great.
Let's move on to another case. I mean, the case of Abu Qatada, why not can't we see he came in here with a false passport? This is a man who says that anyone, Caroline Lucas, who leaves Islam should be killed. And so should their families. And he's coming here with a... Why can't he be sent back to his own country? He's not even a European.
The first thing to say, of course, is that what he said and what he's done is absolutely abominable. But having said that, that is exactly where human rights have to come into force. Because when on those most difficult cases, if one is against torture, then one has to be against the torture of everybody, not just the people that we would rather like to think that are nicer people. It's a fundamental torture.
Abu Qatada.
Well, I think we also make the mistake of thinking that the European right was an improvement on pre-existing British common law, and in many ways it wasn't. Under pre-existing British common law, the injunction against torture was an injunction against cruel and unusual punishment, being replaced now by inhuman and degrading. So in many ways, what pre-existed the introduction of the European Convention on Human Rights was a diminishment of rights. Similar case for we didn't allow private trial.
Yeah.
We allowed any subject of the king to go in and see private trials, and private trials are now under this convention permitted. So what we've got is something I think that in many ways isn't as good as we had before, and I think the idea that it should be reformed along a British Bill of Rights is actually a thoroughly good idea, because what it will give us is a check against what increasingly a top-down imposition of foreign rights culture to an indigenous foreign rights culture, because the notion of every common human rights, your accounts of what human rights are not objective. They vary according to your tradition and your context.
So go on, sorry.
The Human Rights Act actually brought sovereignty back to this country and allowed our judges for the first time to adjudicate on human rights claims in the British courts. Before we had the Human Rights Act, your first port of call would be in Strasbourg. It was a first instance court, and we didn't have British judges interpreting rights in the way that they are now able to,
the problem is every man and his cat is basically claiming human rights now, and the thing is the cost of the general public. You know, the thing is The legal aid system's been abused because everybody wants to claim rights all of a sudden, and there's a man, he said it's his child's right to have a ponytail at school, and the thing is, originally it was set up to protect its citizens of Europe from being persecuted from the state. We have to get back to the core purpose of what the human rights says, real human rights, not because a paedophile thinks he has a hard life because he wants to slop out his cell. If you don't want to go
to the other case was a prisoner, wasn't there, who was allowed to become a father through artificial insemination. Surely, I mean, it was never meant to be about that, Robert. That was a few years back, wasn't it? It was never meant to be about cases like that.
And that's a good thing. We don't want the European Convention on Human Rights frozen in 1950. You have the entire lesbian, gay and transgender minority of Europe extremely grateful that the court has done exactly what Mr. Raab opposes, which is raise European human rights standards in line with social and legal change.
Is this what you mean by other countries that don't quite have our progressive standards, you might say?
I think what we've got, unfortunately, with the interpretation of European human rights is we've got minority claim rights against majorities. And what
Such as?
Well, for instance, that anything on any of the sort of what the point I'm trying to make is we don't, for instance, protect Christians wearing the cross. We don't protect group rights.
We don't be just about
we don't protect large groups, and what we allow European rights law is to give minorities vetoes over majorities, and I think that creates something very problematic in those countries, because we live in a society where we have both norms, and we've got to create tolerance for those who don't live within those norms.
Shouldn't we be a beacon? Shouldn't we be a beacon of these rights?
But I don't think the European Convention is a beacon for those rights, because they actually destroy the notion that rights come with responsibilities. They destroy the notion that rights are based in relationships. And what the European Court does is essentially set society up against itself. They create new forms of citizenry that claim not to have any relationship with other forms of citizenry. They destroy our common collective consciousness and create a society where we don't try and solve problems together, but we have one-way entitlement rights where we don't have to do anything for them. And I think that's profoundly dangerous for minorities and for majorities.
Yes, but the problem that many Christians who agree with Lord Carey have had is that in this country it's the British courts that have not upheld their rights. And now Lord Carey, some might say paradoxically, he's going to Europe with this, isn't he?
Well, it's the only thing that can protect, the only hard-edged piece of law that can protect religious freedom in this country is Article 9 of the Human Rights Act. And that's the piece of legislation that's now being used to try and fight for Christians to be able to wear the cross. So to say that it's against the majority is actually nonsense. It protects every single person, man, woman and child.
We can all disagree on precisely what the balance should be here, and I respect the arguments on the other side. But the formulation of human rights, their expansion, their evolution, their development, ultimately, you've got to have accountable and elected lawmakers responsible for it, not unaccountable judges.
And that's why they have the final say.
Because ultimately, Bella, it undermines public trust. Human rights in this country are becoming dirty words. It's very dangerous for those like me.
And that's because the politicians are setting such a bad example.
Dominic Raab, when the holder of a great office of state, Theresa May, the Home Secretary, uses false information.
Well, she didn't actually.
Oh, didn't she? It was a cat.
There was a cat
involved.
There was a cat.
Which was one of the many factors to prove that they had a genuine relationship.
So the cat was in the case.
Because of a cat. It was absolutely
nonsense. You can criticise.
What was the cat's involvement? We deal with the big questions here.
Let me tell you exactly what it was. The cat was regarded as a material factor in the relationship with a girlfriend, which showed it was serious and allowed him to claim his Article 8 right. Fact.
One of the things that you do to prove that you're in a relationship, you've got a joint
She's in a cat flap now.
You've got joint bills. I wasn't in a cat flap, it was the Home Secretary in the cat flap.
I got quite annoyed with that.
Paul, go on, Paul.
I got quite annoyed with that because that was a very bad example. If they wanted to use an example of a bad case of human rights, why didn't you use the death of a 12-year-old child? The thing is, I had two Home Secretaries. I had from Labour, I have Theresa May, I've had Damien Green, I've had Jack Straw, I've even had David Cameron agree with my opinion and said that this man should have been deported. and it hasn't been. Now,
That's
if the most
Home
powerful
Office's
people...
blunder.
No,
It's
it's partly their fault, but
part.
ultimately he can't use the last line of defence, the Human Rights Act. He was fully aware of his immigration status before he had the children. He had an appeal for asylum.
And you're right, Paul.
It
was that second paragraph, isn't there?
That's right. The thing is he applied for asylum, that was rejected. He had an appeal, that was rejected. He had a judicial review, that was rejected. He was served his deportation papers, he said he should have gone. He evaded authorities because he knew he should have gone, and this is where the problem is with the legal profession also. He hasn't come from Iraq and successfully negotiated our Human Rights Act without help. Someone said, why don't you have a child? Make it even better. Why not have 2 children, then you're home dry?
Which is why the Home Office need to act fast. When they want to get rid of people that have committed offences, serious offences...
But why can't he be sent back now?
Well,
because of his children. He has 2 children who are British citizens.
This is a man, right?
Why are we breaking up another family just because...
He's been disqualified from driving 4 times.
Because this man killed...
You don't punish Mr. Ibrahim's children.
Hang on. Paul. OK, let's look at Mr. Ibrahim, you know. Driving while disqualified 4 times. Leaves a child trapped under the wheels of the car. She's still alive, trapped under the wheels of the car. She's screaming, she's frightened, and he runs to save his own skin. He's been done for possession of drugs, damage to property, theft, intimidation. He even got arrested. The so-called family man, in front of his children, took away in handcuffs for a disturbance of the peace. Now, is this a perfect family man at the end of the day? His children would be better off without him.
Robert, system and the system has failed.
He has a right to family life, you're saying.
The courts are not allowing him to stay in the UK because they have any sympathy for Mr. Ibrahim or any respect for his character or his conduct. It's because they do not want to punish...
Let Robert answer.
They do not want to punish his British children and his British wife by separating a family or else forcing them to move to Iraq.
Many of these cases don't have children or dependents. I've got a case in my constituency, a young waiter killed, body dumped in a river, couldn't be deported, the perpetrator, even though he's got no wife or dependents. We've got 400 cases like this a year.
The British government just won a case exactly like that on Tuesday against a Nigerian man with no family life.
But we've got 400 a year.
The European Court of Human Rights said he could be deported.
But he's not been deprived of a family life. If he wants to go back to Iraq, he can take his family with him. Yeah. If he doesn't, he can go anywhere in the world. He can go anywhere in the world. But he chooses to live 3 miles down the road from me.
The point is we're making human rights a dirty word because what we're doing is we're letting the decisions ultimately be made in a place far, far away from this country that most British people feel isn't
Can I
part
hold
of
you
our
on that,
culture.
actually, Philip? Yeah. Because there's a very interesting point made. You're saying we're making human rights a dirty word, but it's interesting because Sir Nicholas Brazza, who is the head of the European Court of Human Rights, he's dismissed criticism, and he said, I've got the quote here, that it's the kind of ignorance displayed in the popular press. So he's kind of blaming the way that it's all reported. Does he have a point?
Well, what that is contempt for ordinary people and contempt for the values of ordinary people. And until we can bring rights home, until we can have a British-based right where we have politicians who not just claim to be able to act, but act consistently in all cases. We're not going to... rights will divide us, and rights are already dividing us in this room. And they're dividing us because people feel that people are gaming the system. We've got free riders, and that then removes popular political support for rights, which isn't right.
Caroline Lucas.
Well, Philip talks about bringing human rights home, but the irony is that if we get rid of the Human Rights Act, then actually it gives the Strasbourg court more power over what gets done in this country, not less.
Why is that? Why is that?
Because unless, and maybe Dominic will be clear about this, but unless he's proposing that we actually leave the European Convention on Human Rights altogether, which I think would send out a terrible message at a time when people's rights are still under massive attack across the world. If we're saying, you know, 1 out of 48 countries, Britain is going to leave the European Convention on Human Rights, if we don't leave it, then that still means that people will have recourse to the Strasbourg courts, and you won't have British judgment actually mediating that. It'll give more power to Strasbourg, not less.
Let me just take a couple of audience points here as well. Good morning.
Good morning. The whole thing about human rights, so that means if I commit a crime, which is what happened, and I go and kill somebody, I might start arguing, actually, why should I go to prison? My wife is going to find it very difficult, and my newborn baby, and that's what's going to happen. You have rules and regulations to protect the majority of people, and if people come and abuse that, they should be... This is a matter of justice for me. This is a matter of justice.
Protection for criminal defendants in this country long before the Human Rights Act, innocent until proven guilty and all of that. The irony is that the Human Rights Act for the first time gives victims' rights.
Make the case, because there have been positives. Make the case.
The difference is a prison sentence is temporary. Of course your family life is disrupted. Deportation to another country is permanent. It's a lifetime ban on seeing his children. That's why the courts...
Make a case. Wait, please. Make a case for the positives. The DNA database.
Well, exactly. There are a whole set
lesbian,
of cases
gay, bisexual, transgendered rights.
that don't always make the headlines, because let's face it, the media have a vested interest in opposing the Human Rights Act.
What is that vested interest?
It's because Article 8 of the Human Rights Act gives, for the first time in this country, a right to private life, a right to privacy, and that interferes with some of the kiss and tell stories that the tabloids like to do. So they have a profit motive.
But you have a vested interest in the Human Rights Act.
Because I work for a human rights organisation.
That run test cases.
The same thing,
of
course it is.
There's nothing in Article 8 that says what you're saying is basically you can come into this country, you can break any laws you want, and as long as you have a child here, you can stay.
Well, I'm not talking about immigration, I'm talking about the right to privacy, which is something that we all have.
Being deprived of a family life. The thing is...
What about this chap?
Yes, sir. Good morning, sir.
Good morning. You don't want to come over this way?
I'm here. Good morning.
Lovely to meet you.
You too, yeah.
One of the things that happened, I'm an illegal immigrant from Dorset. He was cautioned and all these motor vehicle offences. He came to Portslade Hove. He knocked a father with 3 children. He killed a man. He only got 9 months. Is that a joke?
But that's the British court system, though, isn't it?
Excuse me. So when people see me, I travel by buses. And I will tell you, some white people, when they see me, they like to help me disappear or something, you know. They're being rude. I don't blame them. It's this rotten laws that does all this problem.
Oh, so is it creating that kind of resentment from the blonde?
Yeah. We're now in a situation where, for the most part, we have rights without relationships, without responsibilities, and it puts people against one another. And what we need is to restore rights to the community so that people understand they're reciprocal, and my rights are your responsibilities, and vice versa. And the very fact, and I agree exactly with the comment that you just said there, sir, is it puts people against one another, and it gives majorities... And it gives majorities the idea that minorities are playing them and are taking advantage of them, and that's disastrous for our country.
Thank you very much, and thank you. And the Justice for Amy Houston campaign goes on. Thank you very much indeed for your contribution this morning. Now, if you'd like to have your say about that debate, log on bbc.co.uk/debate questions. You'll find links there to sites where you can continue the discussion online.
Yeah, what my rights were, he said, quite frankly, Mr. Houston, you haven't got any. And how can that be right in a fair and balanced society?
That's what he said.
That's what he said. So, my problem with the Human Rights Act is, I believe in human rights, but I believe it's about balance and fairness. And I believe that my rights should have been taken into consideration, and they haven't been.
And Paul, this was Article 8, wasn't it? The right to a family life, and you believe he had no family life before that and just sort of got one together and used it as an arguing point. Safeguard the right of Christians to display their faith. Has Europe created too many rights? Well, Paul Houston, you, of course, your daughter Amy, you lead this campaign, the Justice for Amy campaign, 12 years old, run over by this man, an Iraqi asylum seeker. He then ran away from the scene. He was caught, sentenced to 8 months in prison, served only 2. He lost his application to stay here, but he wasn't deported. He's still here. Why do you blame, in this terrible case, why do you blame the European Court of Human Rights for the fact that he's still here and natural justice has not been served?
Human rights is about balance and fairness. It's about protecting the innocent and the vulnerable. It's very galling when Amy, my only child, was killed and I don't have a family life anymore. That Mr. Ibrahim should claim that his rights have been deprived and he's been deprived of a family life. At no point was my viewpoint taken into consideration in the courts. And when I asked the human rights barrister for the UKBA,
Good morning to you. Now, by this time next week, the Brighton Declaration may have immortalise this city as the place where the decision was made to curb the power of the European Court of Human Rights. Some British politicians complain it's given too many rights to prisoners and non-European criminals. Some Eastern European nations think it has pandered to the gay and lesbian community. But elderly couples thank it for giving them the right to stay together when social services decide one of them needs to be cared for in a home. And Lord Carey, the former Archbishop of Canterbury, wants it to save...
It's a definition of what is a family life. The scope is that wide, but it basically covers anything. And in some cases, the people aren't married, then sometimes they don't have any children, sometimes they don't even see the children. In some cases, it's just because they have a mother and father. So
you think
basically,
it's ludicrous? You think it's a nonsense thing?
So quite frankly, everybody has a family life. But, you know, the thing is, you know, it just can't be right, basically.
Caroline Lucas, decisions like this are crazy, aren't they?
I mean, that is a very, very troubling